Later. Good morning. Welcome. Sorry to cause all my team a bit of a crisis by being called away to somebody else's crisis right at the beginning of this meeting. Welcome to our conference. It's really good to see everybody on the call. I'm Caroline Jackson, portfolio holder for housing for Lancaster City Council. It's lovely to see so many people, many that I know and many that I don't know. Great to see you all here. This conference is run by Lancaster Vision in partnership with the City Council. As many of you know, I'm part of the new administration elected in 2019, and we've got some really strong priorities about climate change, about communities becoming wealthier and closer, and about really talking and being engaged with the people who are part of our community. And what we're doing today is really part of that. I mean, you've heard all those nice words, but the action really is to say, well, housing is a priority. It can cause wealth, but it's also part of the poverty of the district, as Helen's workshop will talk about. And the more that we engage and talk, the more that we're going to make some progress with you all, I hope. And this, I hope, will be the beginning of something, not the end, not just a conference which is finished and that's it, you've said your bit and that's it. I hope we're going to be able to go on with wider working across our community. One of the key things that is going to come up for us, and is coming up for us, is that we're moving from a kind of model of housing where we got other people to do the important work on affordable housing that we wanted done, whereas now we're looking forward to having a model which will be a lot more hands-on, a lot more where we're trying to have an opportunity to direct. And that's what Kathy Beaton will be talking to you about a little bit later. Two things brought this conference into being. One was us and the city, as a city council, wanting to talk to people who are involved in and interested in housing, and the other is Lancaster Vision, who came to us with their passion to run a conference on housing. So it was a bit of a marriage made in heaven for us. So that we hope is going to be the beginning of some interesting discussions and conferences. Structure of today, well, Kathy is going to outline our home strategy, which is kind of the background to all the work we're doing, and tries to pull together that. It's quite a long document, so she's going to outline it. So if you haven't read it, you don't have to. And if you have read it, it'll pull out the important things for you. And then the workshops that follow up are really, we hope, the points at which you can make some input. It might be the beginning of your input, but where we can pick up and then feedback. We've got a longer feedback session because we really want to know what happened in those. And then at the end, we'll update you on 3 key elements of what we're doing, just to give you a bit more information, and invite you to get more involved through a housing strategy group, which we hope will meet possibly February 25th, the first meeting, where those who would really like to get further involved can start to kind of look at the wide range of what we are doing and what we could do and have your input. So I'm going to hand over now to James Wilkie from Lancaster Vision, who's going to give you the details on procedure. Thank you, James.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me. As Caroline said, I'm James Wilkie. I'm the chair of Lancaster Vision. We're conscious that most of the participants have probably used and been involved in Zoom events before. But we thought that if there was anyone who hadn't, it might just be useful to set out some house rules and etiquette to try and help us make sure this all goes as smoothly as possible this morning. The first thing we'd like to ask you to do is to remain muted until you actually go into the breakout room, and that will kind of minimise any sound feedback. The breakout rooms, you'll be taken automatically into those. You don't have to do anything. and they'll close automatically after 30 minutes. So you don't need to do anything. We'll bring it in and out automatically. At the 1 minute from the close of the breakout sessions, a 1 minute warning will come up on the screen just to make sure that people aren't sort of shocked by the fact they're going back into the main session. And then when you come back into the main session, we'd be grateful if you could mute again. If you have any questions which you'd like to ask, please post them in the chat facility, either before the breakout sessions or during the breakout sessions. But we'd be grateful if people could avoid posting messages. We'd be grateful if just keep it strictly to questions, because we are going to get someone trying to manage the text on that to direct the question, and it will just help that process. After the event, we will be contacting everybody again, requesting feedback and sending out some documentations. So that's all I want to say. So back to you, Caroline.
Thank you. So I'm just going to move on now to Kathy Beaton, who is the Officer City Council, who has the responsibility for our strategy. And she's going to, as I say, introduce you to the home strategy, quite a hefty document, which she used her extra lockdown time to produce for us. So we're really very glad that she did that. It's pulled together. It has got to the stage where we need to consult on it before we can say that that is our final document. And as I said, that is the big point about today. It's a big part of our consultation. So Kathy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. I'm just going to pop up the presentation for us. I'm Kathy Beaton. I'm the Principal Housing Strategy Officer, and I work within the Planning and Housing Strategy team at Lancaster City Council. Before we go into the main body of the presentation, it's probably just worth focusing on what is the role of the home strategy. And it's really about local authorities having an understanding of the housing market and the housing needs in their district. Next slide, please, David. Typically, a housing strategy would cover a 5-year period, and that's what ours is doing. Next slide, please, David. A term that you'll hear throughout the conference today is affordable housing. So I think it's really helpful to just break that down a little bit. So what do we mean by affordable housing? We're talking about social housing, which is owned and managed by local authorities and registered providers with slightly different regulatory frameworks. And certainly for local authorities, we have additional statutory duties that fall upon us. And an example of that is we have a statutory duty around homelessness. The other main form of affordable housing is intermediate housing, and that's aimed at households who are unlikely to qualify for social housing, but who are unable to buy or rent market housing. So in terms of what the local position is there, typically shared ownership is the most commonly seen form of intermediate housing, but it does vary from district to district. So what are the key challenges in Lancaster District? I think it's very, very fair to say that affordability is a key challenge. You know, when you do an analysis of average house prices in Lancaster, you know, typically you're seeing that would be 6 times the equivalent of a single income household. So some real challenges there. For a lot of our households, market rents are unaffordable. In terms of the tenure mix of Lancaster District, only 10% of the total housing stock in the district is social and affordable housing. And when you compare that, the national average is 17%. So our position is considerably lower than the national average. Looking at the social housing supply, there's a mix match between supply and demand. So if you do an analysis of the social housing stock, there's a pretty even mix of 1, 2 and 3 bedroom accommodation when you take account of council stock and RP stock. And when I say RP, I'm talking about registered providers, also known as housing associations. And if you do an analysis of the council's housing register, what you'll see is that at any one year, probably at least 50%, if not more, of the housing register are waiting for one-bedroom accommodation. That does take into account older people as well. So there are some clear issues there around what is the supply and what is the demand. Now, unfortunately, I haven't got time to look at that in real detail today, but for anybody that hasn't looked within the draft document, please do so, because you'll see that clearly evidenced within the section 4 of the document, which is the market analysis. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so what was the lead-in to us producing this new strategy? The last strategy was produced in 2012 and that expired in 2017. Before we started to prepare a new strategy, as part of the local plan preparation, the council commissioned a new housing needs study. That was commissioned in 2018 and we used ARC4 to undertake that work. The study estimated that there are 6,000 households in need of affordable housing in Lancaster District, and leading to that, there would be a continuing need for social and intermediate housing. The study also concluded that our population will increase by 6% by 2033, particularly in the over 65s. So the study was basically suggesting that we need to think about increasing the housing choices of older people. The study also recommended that in terms of housing being developed, new housing of all tenures should contain a wide mix of housing types and sizes. And that was very much about the under-occupation that occurs across all sectors. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so the next two sort of key events that informed the strategy were in 2019. So as we know, the council declared its climate emergency, and that was in January 2019. And then later on in the year, there was a change within the City Council's administration. And as you know, we now have Councillor Caroline Jackson as the Cabinet Member for Housing. One of Caroline's very early actions was to set up a housing strategy member working group. And that was working with staff across different housing services within the City Council to basically develop the new strategy. And there were very obvious key drivers within that process. So we had to think about the climate change agenda, and what can we do to contribute to climate change, review the local need within the district, think about the council's role as an existing social landlord, what opportunities were there in terms of the council's land, and how are we going to access funding. Next slide, please, David. So touching on climate change, as I said, the council declared its climate emergency in January 2019. One of the very early actions that we've done is set up a local plan action review group. And that really is to review the position that we've adopted within the current local plan. When our current local plan was adopted, we set new standards around space and accessibility. So all new housing should now comply with nationally described space standards, and 20% of new housing should be built to accessibility standards. That doesn't go far enough in terms of climate change. So what we're looking to do within the review is to meet our ambition that we want to try and achieve low or zero carbon homes, and also take steps to improve the existing housing stock. Notwithstanding that piece of work, because within the local plan, that would be a generic standard that would apply to anybody building housing, there's nothing to stop the City Council setting its own standards, and that's exactly what we're doing within the home strategy. So in terms of schemes that the council are looking to develop, if they are new build, then clearly our ambition is to make them zero carbon. but we've also set some standards around our existing housing and any of the projects that we've identified. Okay, David, next slide, thanks. So moving on to the housing and regeneration priorities that we've identified in the strategy, there are 6 in total. The Canal Quarter, regeneration of Morecambe, Mainway, Ridge Square, extra care housing for older people, and Mellishore Caravan Park. Next slide, please, David. So in terms of the Canal Quarter, as you can see, hopefully you can see the boundary of the Canal Quarter. So at the top end, the boundary is St Leonard's Gate and Edward Street, and at the bottom end we're stretching across to the car park on Nelson Street. So that's basically the boundary of the Canal Quarter. 60% of the land within the boundary is owned by the City Council in the form of surface car parks. In years gone by, it was always envisaged that that area would provide a regeneration scheme that was predicated on retail. This scheme is a move away from those previous proposals, and we're talking about a mixed-use development. And for the first time, we are expecting to see some housing delivery within those plans. Potentially, we could see a mix of tenures. Nothing is certain around how much housing we can achieve, but as I say, that is a key priority of the City Council. Where we've got to with the Canal Quarter so far is the council has produced a strategic regeneration framework. We did that in 2019, and early in 2020 we did some community engagement. That document is really there to set some principles around the standards and the scope of the scheme, bearing in mind that the council only owns 60%. So we have 40% land interests belonging to other parties, and clearly we need a mechanism to embed some of the principles that we're looking to achieve there. The work will continue this year. So the next stage of our plan is to do the detailed master planning, and that's where we will really thrash out the options for the Canal Quarter and then undertake further consultation. Our ultimate aim is that this is a council-led approach, and of course what we want to try and achieve here is an exemplar scheme. Next slide, please, David. So the next priority is Morecambe. That's been a historic regeneration priority of the City Council. Much of the objectives and targets that were set within the West End Master Plan have actually pretty much been met. But what we see is that it is still an area of considerable housing need. That was borne out by the housing needs study. It typically has lower levels of social housing than other parts of the district, and there is no existing social housing stock within the West End that belongs to the City Council. What we see is that it functions differently in terms of the amount and number of private sector landlords. So that is a big challenge in terms of housing quality and housing cost. There are 2 lower super output areas within the West End area. We know that food and fuel poverty are considerable challenges. In the not too distant past, the council has investigated selective licensing, and that was a tool to try and address some of the issues with private sector landlords. At the time, although we did extensive consultation, a decision was made not to implement a licensing scheme. However, you will see from the home strategy that there is an intention to review that position. So later on in the year, we'll be seeking authority from Cabinet to undertake further consultation. And as I say, that's about giving us another tool to deal with some of the issues within the West End. So I mentioned the West End Master Plan earlier. Much of the objectives was around diversifying the tenure offer in the West End. We feel there's room for more. and potentially there's a role for the City Council. We are very close to setting up a housing company, which will be wholly owned by the City Council. You'll see the term Housing LATCO on the slide, and we're using that as a vehicle to generate funding to take some of our schemes forward. Through the LATCO, initially, it isn't a vehicle to deliver social housing, and I won't get into too much technical jargon around that, but we are using it as a tool to provide what we consider to be affordable private rented sector accommodation. And hopefully it will increase the housing options to people that want to live and work in the West End area. Obviously, we have to start on a fairly small scale. For now, we've pitched that at a pilot scheme of 10 properties. So we'll be looking to acquire 10 properties in the West End in the next financial year. We want to try and grow that portfolio, but clearly what we'll do after the first 10 is review the effectiveness. Bearing in mind that the council is borrowing, we are not getting any external subsidy here. So we do need to keep an eye on the budget position. Next slide, please, David. So the next priority is the regeneration of Mainway Estate. Mainway Estate is in North Lancaster and could be described as not being typical of the rest of the council housing stock. It was built in the 1960s. It's wimpy, no fines concrete construction. There's just over 250 properties. They are predominantly different forms of 2-bedroom flats and maisonettes. The properties are structurally sound, but the external cladding is failing. What we're seeing is that there's moisture penetration getting into the properties. They're expensive to heat. There's issues around, the client group and suitability of those properties, bearing in mind that with welfare reform and the bedroom tax, there's limited scope for the City Council to under-occupy its stock. So we're talking about families living in those properties. I think it's fair to say that the estate lacks community cohesion in its current form, and we do see issues around antisocial behaviour. So back in July last year, we took a report to Cabinet to seek authority to consult the tenants of residence. We commenced that consultation in August. The work is still ongoing, but ultimately we want to explore a comprehensive regeneration scheme for Mainway. So I'm not going to say any more about Mainway because I know Caroline's going to say in her roundup session in the plenary session. So I'll leave it there for now. Next slide, please, David. This is just a quick shot of Mainway for anybody that doesn't know the area. You can see in the background, we've got an 11-storey tower block. The rest of the buildings on the right-hand side are all 3-storey, 2-bedroom flats. On the other side of the road, it's a mixture of maisonettes and similar flat blocks. So if you don't know Mainway, that's what it looks like. Next slide, please, David. Okay, the next priority is Ridge Square, which is on the Ridge Estate in Lancaster. It's a little mixed tenure scheme which combines two retail, a general store and a fish and chip shop. We have a community centre there and we have housing. Most of the housing is council owned. There are some properties that have been sold under the right to buy, but it's fair to say that those properties are poor in terms of layout and access. Ridge Square over the years has been a magnet for antisocial behaviour. So we've identified it as a priority with the intention of doing some consultation and investigating any options that we could take forward. So in many ways, this is a more medium-term priority, but it's there and it's been identified. Next slide, please, David. The next key priority is the provision of extra care housing. So this has been a joint objective of the City and County Council pretty much since 2013. You'll remember me mentioning that the housing needs study has suggested that we need to look at the ageing population and think about the choices available to older people. I think it's fair to say that within the existing social housing provision, there is quite a good deal of choice for older people. There's lots of different providers, and you know, the City Council is actually the biggest landlord, social landlord for older people. However, there's a gap there, and we need to try and fill that gap. So for anybody that has never heard of the term extra care housing, extra care housing is self-contained properties. I know that says units and I hate that term, but it's generally in the form of apartments with an on-site care team, and typically they're provided in a community hub type setting where you would expect to see other services within that building or very close by. The underlying issue here is that there are far too many admissions into residential care year on year within Lancashire. Obviously that has caused the County Council's considerable issue, but importantly, what we want to be able to do here is catch people before they're forced into residential care. So ultimately, we want to enable older people to remain in an independent setting for longer, and that's what they want too. We have two potential opportunities to deliver schemes in Lancaster. The City Council is looking to deliver a scheme on a site in North Lancaster. We don't own the site, so we're in the process of trying to acquire the site. And a partner organisation called Progress Housing Group are currently taking a proposal forward in South Lancaster. So if both of those schemes come into fruition, we will be, we will be well on our way to meeting that gap within the housing offer for older people. Next slide, please, David. And the final priority that we've identified is Mellishore Caravan Park. That's an existing site of 19 traveller pitches on Mellishore Lane. Previously, it was in the ownership of the County Council, but for many years been managed by the City Council. In 2019, the County Council declared the site as surplus. We saw the potential for those existing residents to be in a pretty vulnerable position with the prospect of the county disposing of the site. So the council took the decision that we would take over the ownership of the site. So it's now owned by the City Council, fully acknowledging that the site is in need of major reinvestment. So at the time the council took that decision, we also basically built in the budget provision to undertake a capital programme over a 4-year period. So that's all agreed and described in the home strategy. Next slide, please, David. You will see within the home strategy document that retrofitting is mentioned in several parts. Clearly, whilst we have set our ambitions around new build housing, we can't forget about the existing housing. And, you know, ultimately, we have set ourselves targets for our own stock. We want to try and get our council housing stock up to EPCC by 2030. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that those properties are going to be zero carbon. That's a minimum standard that we're setting ourselves. However, incrementally, we will be working to try and improve those standards. And we will also be taking advantage of any government grant that allows us to do that. So we've set the same standards in terms of properties that the LATCO will acquire. Our ultimate intention is when we buy those properties in Morecambe, we will be retrofitting them up to a minimum of EPCC. If we can get them beyond that, fantastic, and we will be ultimately looking to draw down funding to get them beyond that going forward. So in terms of government funding, the government in the summer launched the Green Homes Grant Scheme. And one of the strands of funding is for local authorities to bid. So I'm not going to say too much on this because I know it's going to be discussed in the workshop on climate change, but just so you're aware, Lancaster has bid with a consortia of other authorities in Lancashire for the funding in round one. We haven't been notified of whether we've been successful, and we're gearing up to put a bid in for the next round of funding. In terms of increasing our own capacity, what we'd like to do is train our existing repairs and maintenance staff to become trained installers of measures. We've recently created an energy officer post within the City Council. That's been filled by a colleague called Flo Henriksson, and Flo will be working with existing council tenants around maximising their incomes, working with them on their energy bills and supporting them so that if we get an opportunity to install measures in properties, that she will support them through that process. The other thing that we're doing is creating a retrofit advisor post within the Home Improvement Agency. The Home Improvement Agency undertake a wide range of functions working with vulnerable people, primarily around aids and adaptations. We offer a handy person service. So the sort of the missing link is doing the assessments and getting some energy measures in. So hopefully we can plug that gap. Next slide, please, David. So just touching on how are we going to deliver all of this? As I said earlier, with schemes like the Canal Quarter, clearly we have an opportunity, because if we're using our own land, we can control what happens to it. We are going to, as far as we possibly can, explore borrowing opportunities within the housing revenue account, which is where all the council house rents sit. The borrowing cap was abolished by Theresa May in 2017. So there are some freedoms there. Obviously, you know, we have to be prudent, but we can look to borrow money to deliver on our objectives. And as I said earlier, we're setting up the Housing LATCO. That allows us to set up a vehicle with the council being able to borrow through the general fund and on lend to the LATCO. Again, obviously, we have to be prudent. And as I said earlier, schemes have got to be self-financing and pay for themselves. That said, wherever we can, we will look to draw down Homes England grant. Not all of the schemes that we've discussed are eligible for Homes England grant, but obviously we will do everything we can to draw down external funding, and look out for any other opportunities that may present themselves in the future. Next slide, please, David. So now turning to the biggest section of the strategy, which is all about the needs of specific groups. And I'm just going to whiz through this. We haven't got time to go through everything in detail, but I couldn't possibly not mention homeless households. And what I would draw your attention to is the fact that the council adopted its homelessness strategy in 2020. But much of the work that was done at that time was done before COVID. So what the home strategy attempts to do is actually bring us up to speed with everything that's happened around homelessness through the pandemic. So, we had the Everyone In campaign, which has allowed us to work collaboratively with lots of different organisations and bring all our rough sleepers indoors. And we are continuing to maintain that position. In terms of where the homelessness strategy links directly to the home strategy, a key objective is for us to try and improve access to settled housing for people that experience homelessness, or whether they're in supported housing and they need to move on to something longer term. So that's a key priority. We have identified the need to increase some of the temporary accommodation and more sort of specialist complex needs solutions for homeless households. Although it has to be recognised that we have got more commission services than a lot of other of our neighbouring districts. So we are fortunate there, but there are some gaps. We want to be able to improve access to the private sector, and clearly we've talked about how we might be able to do that. And we also want to make use of the government grants. The government has pledged 4 years commitment within the Next Steps accommodation programme. We were eligible for funding in September. That is helping us to maintain our position, and we'll be looking to bid in future programmes. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so the other specific groups that get a mention in the home strategy, and we go into a bit of detail, are all on the next slide. Some of the groups that are identified, obviously with older people, we've already talked in detail about that. It's really just a position statement on where what the provision is and where we think we need to be going forward. Next slide, please, David. And I think the four sort of main, the most significant needs that we need to address, we'd have to start with young people and looked after children. At the time we produced the home strategy, Lancashire County Council were just about to start a re-tendering exercise of their young people services. So unfortunately, it wasn't the time to try and describe in detail what the future pathway needs to be for young people. So we have described some of the issues in the home strategy, but what we've done is given a commitment to continue to work with commissioning leads at the County Council to develop a more detailed action plan and something that's a bit more measurable. But we have had discussions, and there are some new service models that we do want to explore with the county. In terms of ex-offenders, before the pandemic, we'd started having discussions with HMP Lancaster Farms to try and improve the pathways of people leaving prison that have got a connection to Lancaster District. And we talked about a pilot scheme that would involve the City Council and a partner organisation called Calico, and trying to link supported housing and a training opportunity for people leaving prison, and try and make things more joined up than they are now. So we're still very committed to looking at that pilot scheme, but as I say, COVID has just got in the way with that. Older people have already sort of set out the position that the most acute need is to bring forward extra care housing. And then finally, people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, autism and or mental health. We work very closely with Lancashire County Council to develop more supported living apartments in Lancaster District. A number of opportunities are presenting themselves, but the starting position for this group is most of them live in group homes because that's all there is available. And certainly for the younger adults coming through the system, that they want the choice. They're no different to any other group. So we need to improve the offer to that group and look at more independent settings for them. So we've basically measured that within the home strategy that we want to try and develop 50 supported living apartments in the next 5 years. Next slide, please, David. Okay, so just to sum everything up then, the key messages really are that there is a significant need to increase the supply of social and affordable housing in Lancaster District. We see the council as being a key player in that delivery. Having said that, we still need to work very closely with registered providers. Their role is also critical. And when you reflect on the fact that since 2012, we've had 760 affordable housing completions delivered exclusively through RPs, their role is critical to this. We also want to explore opportunities for more community-led housing in Lancaster District. We're currently working with 2 groups who are delivering exemplar schemes in Halton. We benefited from some central government funding in 2017, and we've used that funding to support those 2 groups. And, you know, we want to continue that work. We want to maximise the opportunities to improve the existing housing and improve quality and choice in the private sector. And we want to use the tools available to ensure that homes meet future needs and help the district to become carbon neutral. Next slide, please, David. Just a reminder that in terms of the home strategy consultation, the consultation runs to the 1st of February. If you don't get an opportunity to share any of your views at the event today, please do get in touch with us. We will be circulating the presentation slides. You can see on this final slide are all my contact details. And as I say, do get in touch with us. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation for this morning.
Thank you, Kathy. I hope that has given you a lot of food for thought for how, what's actually happening, what we're hoping might happen, and for things you might want to talk about if you've chosen one of those particular workshops, which are strongly, obviously they're all linked to the consultation and to the home strategy. I'm just checking the time. We're moving on to the workshops at this point, and I think I need to pass over to David, who is in charge of making sure we all get there, just to say a word or two and then to send us off. So thank you again, Kathy. I have been told and reminded that if you want to tweet about what's going on here, and we'd love you to do that, if you look in the chat, you'll find the hashtag that you can use for it. Okay. So welcome back to the main session. We obviously had a slowish start to the groups, and I think our group was probably just getting underway really, and we could have had quite a bit more discussion. But thank you to everybody who managed to get their input into the group, and hopefully some people who want to put more input in may join us in wanting to be part of the housing advisory group later. So I think I might need to take David's advice first on timings and breaks and so on. So David, how do you envisage the timings going now?
I think everybody will probably need a break now, won't they?
Yes.
So if we say, can we come back at 11:45? Would that be okay? And that gets us closer to on track.
Yep.
Yep.
It would be helpful from the point of view of feedback if those of us who are the groups that have gone to feedback would have a quick chat across each other about how we're going to do that.
Yeah.
You know, 2 minutes earlier than 11:45, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I agree, Charles.
Okay. Right.
Well, let's leave the meeting open, and anybody that wishes to have a comfort break, please do so. And then perhaps we'll reconvene the meeting properly at 11:45.
Okay.
Okay, and then in the meantime we can have a chat.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank you very much. See you later. It's 11:45, so being obedient to David's timings. Welcome back. If you're still like me, got your coffee, please go on drinking it. It's really good to see everybody back again. We now have the feedback from the 4 groups, and when I go to any conference, this is the moment of panic, especially if I've been asked to feedback, because I can never remember which group it was I was in, despite the fact that it carefully saying it when it sends you off. So at the moment, I'm a bit blank about which group's which. So if we could just decide which groups are going when, that will be a good start. So David will, of course, know which groups are which, or James will. I think we were group 3, Kathy. Is that right?
So we were the group that was discussing increasing the supply of affordable housing,
but I can't remember
social housing.
But were we group 3?
I don't know. I can't remember now.
There we are. I'm glad to find the group leader doesn't know either.
I think that was 1.
Yeah.
All right, we were group 1, so that's our feedback. First group 2. Charles, have you got the list there?
No, I can't remember exactly.
I can tell you if you like. It's
Thank you, David.
Increasing and improving the supply of social housing was group 1. That was Kathy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Group 2 is the role of community-led housing,
Right.
that's Charles. And group 3 is the housing poverty with Helen.
Right.
And group 4 is the homes strategy and the climate emergency with Kevin.
Right. So each of those groups I know had a facilitator, somebody who was going to make sure they did the feedback. So if we could start with the first group, which was about increasing the supply of social affordable housing, and did look at quite a lot of things related to social housing. Joe, I think you're going to feedback for us.
Yeah, so yeah, I think we're doing a double act, aren't we, Caroline? So
I'll help a bit, yes.
So yeah, obviously there was a bit of a slow start, but when we got some members, it was really good to hear some feedback. So obviously, what I will say, I don't think we massively touched on the increase in the supply, but we definitely touched on the quality of accommodation. And then also striking that balance about working with local partners and also local people in the neighbourhoods that accommodations in, which is really good. So in terms of, I mean, we posed some specific questions right at the start, which were firstly, I suppose, did Kathy's presentation at the beginning and does the home strategy miss any specific needs of different groups that hadn't been covered? Were there any what did people think of the priorities that Kathy talked through right at the start? Are there any main barriers, challenges or opportunities for delivering more affordable housing? Did the people reading the strategy and listening to Kathy think of did the strategy meet the right balance, strike the right balance between the housing needs and the climate emergency? And then really looking at housing and how the pandemic has changed opinions and views on what we might want to be doing in the future. So I think overall there seemed to be confidence that the strategy encapsulates all of the key groups. There didn't really seem to be many people missing from that. I know that we touched on sofa surfers and making sure that we make reference to that group. And what was really interesting is we also touched upon the general needs of older people. Obviously, the strategy really focuses on extra care provision. And what we talked about is perhaps doing a bit more analysis of our older population that may want to wish to remain in general needs accommodation, starting
those people who fell into that intermediate needs bracket. Those people who are in, and those are often people who can afford just about the rent, but would much rather be able to buy, but can't buy except on shared. So it's another area that we need more information on. So I think that wraps up all the things that we got from our group. So it'd be good to move on to group 2, which was Charles' group about community-led housing, and whoever's feeding back for you, Charles.
I'll start, but we didn't have a lot of time for as much discussion as I'd hoped. So what I was going to do was feed back something, but then invite Lois, my fellow presenter, and Becky from LCC, and our other group members to add anything else that they want to add, if that's okay. I won't describe community-led housing. I mean, that'll be in the slides. One big question was, how can you scale up from the 20 strong house scheme that we've been describing in Holton up to hundreds, or what could you do in the Canal Quarter, other ideas like that. And so we talked a bit about scaling, and we said that one of the advantages of our 20 house scale is it's not a Lilliput project. It's real scale. The costs are real. The issues are real. Learning how to do good legal partnership with the housing association, learning the actual costs of designing to these higher qualities, being able to research and monitor what happens on the site about lower running costs. All those issues from the site will help to provide the data and the learning that will improve, that will make it easier for other people to scale it up. So in the designs, the passive house designs are very low carbon and low running costs. The space, they're all immediately replicable, if you like, at a larger scale, and other councils around the country have done them at the scale of hundreds. So we think it is eminently scalable up. One of the other key costs from Matt, our planner, was how does the extra cost of this up front fit with all the other extra costs that developers complain about in terms of financial viability? And clearly that's an issue, a much bigger issue, if you like, about project viability. But the value of this project is that we'll be able to provide real data on what actual costs are and how it can be done. So that will help to make sure that people, when arguments are being made about that, we have real facts about it. And the other strong lesson, I think, is that the more of these they do, the more the costs come down. We're training contractors up and designers up and planners up in terms of how to handle this. Becky, I was going to ask you, you raised the question about if you're going to do community-led housing, you need a community group to start it. Do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, just in case there's anybody else out there in the audience who might be interested, it's, the council or registered providers housing associations can only do what Charles and his team have done if there is a community group out there to work with, and if there is, it gives so much more opportunity to create low carbon homes and homes that stay affordable in perpetuity, and to be more creative about what you're creating. So if anyone's interested and would like to talk more to me about starting a community-led housing group, then yeah, please get in touch.
Lois, do you want to add anything?
Sorry, I just had a dog interruption.
Okay.
So I missed a little of what you were saying, Charles.
Yeah, we'll tell you if you're saying the same thing. It's all right. Carry on.
Okay. So I think the headlines for me, which came out with the additional cost of building the low energy measures, and ensuring a higher quality product, and then just before we finished, one of our attendees mentioned the accessibility of sites and availability of sites, and how you actually, I presume she was going to go on to say how we can finance purchase and so on. So I think those are the main things.
Do any of our other, I'd like to add one more thing, but does anybody else of our people who were in our session feel that we haven't covered something that they'd like to say about the value of this, or what help you'd need? Tim or Matt, or is it or good things? Anybody else want to add any question?
I'd just like to.
Oh, Tim, yes, thank you. Just
to point out that there's a viability problem.
Molly's partner. Dan. I think you're muted, Tim.
Tim, you weren't muted, but now you're not. Carry on.
Sorry, I just wanted to point out that there's a viability problem. That the way that the process of approving plans in Lancaster, in the country, means that they have to be viable. And so one of the consequences of the Holton site that Charles and Lois were telling us about is that there's no contribution towards education provision because the site is not really viable, even with all the work that's put in for free by Charles and Lois and the support it's got from a number of other sources. So it's an issue that I just wanted to flag up, that as we think about scaling up and taking that model forward, we have to keep an eye on viability and tackle how we challenge the existing approach to viability. Sorry about that.
Anybody else want to add anything, or I'd like to add something to that if I can.
Can I reiterate what Tim has said, in that through the North Lancashire Community Land Trust, we looked at over about 4 years over many possible projects, and they mostly failed to materialize because of the financial viability that we could achieve. We just couldn't make them work financially for us, especially when you're competing with sites that have a purely commercial angle to them. Trying to build in the extra community benefit without any extra funding just proved impossible for us.
If I can perhaps comment on the funding then too. One of the absolutely crucial things for this project has been the support that LCC, Lancaster City Council, was able to give to the upfront risky stages, if you like, the feasibility and the pre-planning, because at those risky stages, people are least likely to want to be innovative or to try new ideas like partnership with community groups. And the fact that the funding from LCC, the seed funding there, de-risked that for the parties, if you like, certainly helped to contribute to the innovative idea. The other key thing about this site, of course, is that because no affordable housing had been built in the area for some time, this has to be 100% affordable, which of course changes the usual dynamics of cost subsidy and from a conventional project. And that's one reason why it's expensive. The other, or seems expensive in grant terms. The other thing is that Homes England can provide higher level grants to community-led housing than they can to conventional housing association sites. So there are various tools, but I think you're right that we must recognize we are able to demonstrate one aspect of innovation here. And what we now need to do is to use this data and try the next one, which is a purely conventional site with cross subsidy from housing and no other special advantages, and then show how it can be done at that level. So we need candidates for that next step in the demonstration process.
I think, Charles, can I just add to that just very quickly? One of our group members said, it would be really helpful if we were able to share any findings that we have from our project, including costs. So I suppose that's something we'll be looking to do through the Community Land Trust anyway. But I think providing really detailed analysis of the viability after we have completed will be a really useful tool for lots of other groups looking forward.
Yep. And the other responsibility I think that we have in operation once it's built is to see how far the benefits of, because of avoiding fuel poverty, etc., how far the benefits of lower voids, lower rent arrears, better quality buildings leading less maintenance, how all those other aspects that go into the overall viability for a provider come to bear, so that we've got the whole picture. Lucy, I see you're there. Are you from SLH?
Yes.
Having listening to this, have you got any thoughts you want to throw in?
The only thing I was just going to ask, in terms of obviously discussions around viability, is the viability of the issues being raised through kind of landowners' high expectations on land values, or is it in terms of the abnormalities in the ground, or is it purely you facing the issues in terms of build cost? And that's obviously being new into SLH and this scheme, and working with the Land Trust, it's kind of experiencing what issues are you having in terms of viability that's stopping you from progressing, I guess. But in terms of what Charles was saying, in terms of that whole education piece, we need to obviously learn as an organisation to be able to move forward. It's that education piece with our assets, our housing management team, and be able to feed back a year after, 2 years after, 3 years after, in terms of how those tenants are living in those properties as well.
Yeah,
I think that's an excellent point. We were lucky to have Lucy in the group that I was in, and she did give us quite an interesting sort of update on this from the point of view of the housing association. I think we need to move on now to the next group. So thank you for that. Helen, if you'd like to feed back on...
I'm going to ask Sue Whiddon, who took the notes, to feed back Caroline, if that's okay.
That's great. Thanks, Sue.
Hi. Helen started off the workshop by saying, talking about what housing poverty included, which wasn't just affordability, but also included things like disrepair and the impact that has on people's health, whether it's mental or physical well-being. Also things like insecurity, because in the private sector, people can lose their tenancy after 6 months, as already been described, and this disrupts everything in the household and breaks up communities. And also the impact that the coronavirus has had on people in poverty. It's made it obviously much, much worse. There's choices between heating and eating, that sort of thing. The poor housing cost impact on the NHS because of all the mental stress, anxiety, physical health, and the fact that all of these things in the private rented sector can't really be challenged for people on low incomes because there's very little legal aid available for housing, and Citizens Advice employs the only legally aided solicitors in Lancashire, so there's a big work burden to try and get help for people to challenge the difficulties that they experience in the private sector, and also the impact that on people in poverty, the physical health and challenge for people on low incomes is decreased, and for housing tenants has work burden to try and get entered. So people in social housing are kind of better cared for, better looked after in the terms of their tenancies than those in the private rented sector. Helen had 5 questions to ask the group, of which we only managed to get through 2, quite complex enough. So I'll feed back on the 2 that we looked at. And just a minute while I find my notes. The first one was about building affordable or better improvement of supply of affordable housing. And the definition of affordable was agreed to be that housing costs should be 30%, no more than 30% of household income. And for people who are on an income of, 10,000 a year, that's obviously never going to be possible. So how are people to be supported in their tenancies, whether it's private or social? A lot of emphasis was placed on the role of the private sector, reasonably enough, since it's increasing all the time, and acknowledge that there are many really good landlords, but that the law tends to be weighted on the side of private landlords. And if you're not a good landlord, if you're one of the less good landlords, obviously you can take advantage of that and not repair your tenants' housing, not look after them, evict people without good reason, and that sort of thing. So a lot of questions were raised about how to bring private sector renting up to scratch, which could be possibly through licensing, possibly through retrofitting in the private rented sector, which has been touched on by Kathy in the strategy, and just work better with private landlords to have a better working relationship. But the impact of all these things to improve the rented sector, the private rented sector, might well lead to a rise in rent costs, which again would price people on really low incomes or people on benefits. So things like, so it's a bit of the impact that had on people in poverty sort of thing, and poor housing cost impact on stack up economically. But with the help of maybe housing companies or better provision through benefit, I mean, housing benefit is being picked away all the time by various cuts in benefits, which of course have a huge impact on people on low incomes or who only income is benefit. So those are various areas which we'll try and improve better provision through access for people to affordable housing, whether it was being chipped away on low incomes or who high and short housing. The other question that we managed to touch on was, what was the role, the fact that of local community groups and the third sector in improving the situation of people in housing poverty? And during the pandemic, in social housing, you do a lot to get through to and about building statutory services, sort of checking up on people if they're lonely, to make sure
hearing you.
They're never going to be in
Could people
private
if they're not muted?
That the law tends to be and not repair. Can you hear me now? Being chipped away at all the time by very income is benefit. So access for people to affordably managed to touch on was community groups, and the third sector become quite clear that community groups can services sort of checking up on people. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, much better now, Sue.
Right, okay. Just touching on the role of community groups, which have really developed during the pandemic, and third sector faith groups and so on, how they've helped to support people in their tenancies by making sure that they do have access to day-to-day services, and that anything that's going wrong are addressed if they haven't been able to get out or they don't have links to statutory services. And just wondering how these can be maintained when one day the pandemic goes away or gets to reduced. One wouldn't want to see these community efforts to be dissipated. A lot of them hinge on one or two people, and it's a lot of work for those, and whether there be some sort of infrastructure support through the City Council for community groups to maintain these sort of services to people, so that people who do need extra help but don't realise what's out there can be referred or pointed in that sort of direction. And that was really about it, I think, Helen, unless you feel I've missed something off. You're muted, Helen.
Yes, thank you, Sue. I think that sums it up quite nicely. I think we were concerned. We were concerned to stress there's some really great landlords out there, but we're also concerned about the not so great landlords, and that we know, all of us know, that we get lots of clients in Citizens Advice, lots of clients going to the City Council, to the other third sector groups that we've got in Morecambe and Lancaster, but there's still a hell of a lot of people who are struggling on their own, who have no idea what the rights are, what the landlord's rights and obligations are. And we felt that possibly through Caroline's Housing Advisory Group, that might be the thread that brings us all together to highlight those issues and to start thrashing out how we can become involved in the more statutory provision and support in partnership with the City Council and the whole third sector. But not just the third sector, but recognising that there's lots and lots, as Sue said, lots of people, lots of individuals in the community who've made huge differences to people. And I think there's a risk that we start to try and manage those and get them to tick boxes and get them to count and all that sort of thing, which completely puts people off. So it's having a different soft touch approach and acknowledging that those community groups are providing phenomenal work, and if you put it all together, then they are making a huge difference, but they don't have the ability to start ticking boxes and fitting into you know, funders' requirements and that sort of thing, contract compliance. But what was clear from the group, I think, was there's a real need, there's a real desire in the community to help. And as we all know, capturing that is really difficult. The other thing that I touched on was the need to consult with people with lived experience. We've so often, as I said at the beginning of my talk, for 20 odd years, we've been trying to achieve some changes in housing law, housing policy and legislation. And each time it's been piecemeal. And each time it's not asked the people who have got lived experience of living in horrible housing or who are street homeless. And I think that's one of the things that our district this year and last year have done really well, is to get involved with the Poverty Truth Commission, to get involved and listen really deeply to people who have got lived experience, because they've got a lot of great ideas and a lot of drive to make a difference. And that's us done.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for picking up that point about lived experience. It came through in the group that I was in. It clearly, Charles and what he's done, he is the lived experience there, and you are actually the lived experience of community-led housing, and we're very grateful to have you. And I think that we need to, as part of the community engagement we're doing, we really need to make sure that we're always aware of that lived experience. I think it's been actually a great pleasure to be involved in it. I guess it's more about making that lived experience count. Listening isn't the thing, it's actually acting on it.
Yeah, good at talking, now we need to get good at doing.
Indeed. Thank you for the input from that group. And then the last group is the group that was looking particularly on the climate change side. Kevin, who's going to present the feedback for you.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. And we covered an incredible amount in a short time, so I'll do my best. I started by mentioning that the council declared a climate emergency. One of the things that we said we'd do is set up a people's jury, which we did, and some of the recommendations of that people's jury involve housing, so both new housing and existing housing. So do have a look on the Lancaster City Council website for what the people's jury said, because all of those recommendations are being taken forward by the Climate Change and Environment Cabinet Advisory Group, and I need to talk to Caroline about making sure that we don't have an overlap, because obviously housing, what we do about housing has a significant effect on climate change. I also mentioned a couple of things that people can tap into, the Green Homes grants, which got off to a very bad start with a lack of people to do it and a lot of paperwork. The council, as you heard in the first session, have applied for phase 1B, and that the council intend to appoint a retrofit advisor. So basically, we're going to be able to help facilitate that process of putting together homeowners and installers, and hopefully help the process to run more smoothly, as well as actually using some of that money to retrofit our own properties. And I also mentioned the Future Home Standard. The consultation was finally reported on yesterday, and one of the things that we feared would happen didn't, which means that we have an opportunity to tell developers to build to a higher standard than the current legislation allows. So we've got the local plan review group, which is another thing that you might want to find out more about, and that local plan review group can look at that and see what we can put in the local plan that will require developers to build to a higher zero carbon standard. And then also mentioned that we've got a Lancashire-wide Cosy Homes in Lancashire, and we've also got Green Rose Community Interest Company in Morecambe, and both of those will help towards giving energy advice and giving advice on claiming those grants and so on. So we were looking at, well, it was mentioned a couple of times that, of course, the legislation from government is still totally inadequate and the money that's available is inadequate. So we do have to keep, there was lots of pressure put on government about the Future Home Standard, and we need to be part of keeping up that pressure on government to enable us to do what we want to do. Simon Gershon, who's got long experience of retrofitting houses, reminded us, gave us a reality check, if you like, that the average age of houses in Lancaster is 100 years old, and that won't change. So the biggest thing that we need to do to address the carbon emissions from housing is to retrofit old houses, both the fabric of them and also replacing the heating systems and so on. So we moved on to heating systems. We had Steve Wrigley from Lancaster University. They're working on hydrogen. So the government in the Future Home Standard are planning to stop gas boilers being installed from 2025. But Steve pointed out that could change if hydrogen becomes viable to be put into the gas network. Then maybe we'd get boilers that were hydrogen ready. We talked quite a lot about the small things that could be done, soft things that could be done to reduce carbon emissions, and also emphasise that addressing fuel poverty and reducing emissions are the same thing, really. If you address fuel poverty and you make homes warmer, and you're also going to reduce the carbon emissions. There are lots of smaller things that can be done, draft excluder and things like that. And we were, Florence introduced herself, who's going to be giving that sort of energy saving advice to council house tenants, but the information that we put on the Lancaster City Council website is going to be useful for all people. So she's the council's energy support officer. What else? I think that, we talked about district heating being another possible option, and there are a couple of projects that are being trialled in Lancashire through the Northwest Energy Hub. And there is a village in Cambridge where they're spending a few million on installing a heat network in Swaffham Prior to look at how that works in the existing village. So it's an option for new housing. So we talked about the possibility for Lancaster University, who have a big heat network, extending that to Balerig Garden Village. But there's also the possibility of retrofitting that to existing places, and of course the new build that the council do. I think that's probably most of it. Anybody want to, Susanna, do you want to quickly jump in if there's anything I've missed?
Yes, thank you. I think Kevin, you covered all of our main bases there. So was there anything you wanted to add, Diane?
No, I think Kevin's got it all there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And just finally to emphasise that we've got an incredible depth of experience. Steve mentioned that when a study on the viability of heat networks was mentioned, that Lancaster University have already done a lot. So the session really emphasised the importance of bringing everybody, all that expertise together, that community knowledge, and tapping into what's been done before, tapping into the sort of expertise that people already have with doing things and together. So, do get involved in these cabinet advisory groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much for that input. So I think we've, it feels a bit like we've opened a can of worms, very good worms, but there's an awful lot to pick up from here. I note there was one comment in the chat, which was from Simon, who's just been mentioned, about the North Lancashire Community Land Trust as a vehicle for delivering new housing projects. So just a note there that Simon's a possible contact for anybody who is looking or is just contemplating from the point of view of community-led housing. He's a real expert in providing housing to a very high standard from old buildings. So he's a great person to talk to about that as well. I'm looking, as Kevin said, a huge depth of experience here, and we have brought out an awful lot of information. I was billed at the end of this conference for talking about 3 key things. I'm going to say that a lot of what I was going to say has been covered, either in this feedback or in what Kathy said at the beginning. So I probably won't take up a lot of your time, which is probably a good thing because we've only got about 4 minutes left. So I'll comment on mainly our approach to climate and retrofitting. So as far as Mainway goes, I think Kathy outlined the situation there. I think the big thing about Mainway is that it's a huge opportunity, whatever we do in the future, to adapt that housing and the way it is currently, for the format of it really, to what we want now. I think we have high standards now of community and high standards about how we want our communities to work together. And COVID has made us very aware of things like defensible space, being able to get straight into the wider natural world. And so whatever happens with Mainway, and we may start from scratch, or we may be refurbishing the buildings, it isn't just about making sure that the buildings don't fall apart. It's about actually making that housing suitable for the community that is living there. So that's a real key thing, and it is an opportunity to work with the community. And I think it's the first time that we've done real in-depth community engagement, which we've been supported by the university to do, and get to grips with the fact that if when you talk to people, they don't necessarily come up with the things you expect them to come up with, and you really have to think about what's needed and what people express as their concerns. So I'd say that what we're learning most is how to work with our community from that Mainway project. On the subject of retrofitting, I think retrofitting is basically learning about your current housing stock. And the one thing that the retrofitting project, and we've only done, I think it's 4 houses so far, is we've learned an enormous amount about the housing stock that we've got. Sensibly, Andrew Whitaker, who's in charge of this, chose to do it with the kind of typical housing that we have in Lancaster's typical social housing. So we now find out about the poor construction methods in some parts of the housing. It's not bad housing, it's still here after all. But we're learning about that. We've learned about cold spots, where the mold grows, where the ventilation needs improving. So we've learned an enormous amount about our housing. We've also learned how expensive it is to retrofit and how to use our money to the best effect. So I think what I'd say about that is it's a learning experience, and perhaps one of the big things we should do is to share that learning experience. Over the climate emergency response, that too has pushed us to make sure that we look at what our stock is like and what we do. And we have some quite complex problems with how we get our stock up to the standard of energy efficiency that it needs to have in order that people are not in fuel poverty. So there is ongoing work, and the fact that we started to do things like fit solar panels with the battery backup so that they really are useful to people and reduce their bills, I think again is great learning. So what we want to do, I think, in terms of our own housing is to learn a lot about it so that we've got that expertise. Flo is one of the people with new staff who's going to give us a great insight, and then she's going to be able to communicate that to the people who live in it and have to work with what we give them as housing. And finally, I think the passive house standard, Kevin, that's fantastic news about what we can say to builders, developers, that we can insist on high standards. We have to insist on those high standards for ourselves first and make sure that all of the building we do is at that standard. So I'm looking forward to doing that, but we don't underrate. I think viability, cost has been a big theme in this conference, and it's something we have to struggle with, and we will continue to struggle with. But I don't want to end on a down note. I think what I want to end on is a note that says we are really grateful to all of you for coming to this. We're really looking forward to pulling together all the consultation responses and to inviting you to get involved further in any way that you're interested. I know Kevin is running a climate advisory group. Some of you might be more interested in that aspect, and I'm starting a housing advisory group, as I say, potentially 25th of February for the first meeting. If you would like to be part of that group, the best thing I think would be to email Kathy, who kindly put her details up before, or please email me, and I'll put my email into the chat. But also I think it's quite easy to find a councillor's email. We're all the same. I'm cjackson@lancaster.gov.uk. So you just put our initial and name in, plus lancaster.gov.uk. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much to our hosts, Lancaster Vision. David, for struggling with that technology, and I know you did, and it worked. Thank you very much. And to the organising committee who are here, including James and Sue, and I hope that we'll see you again at a similar kind of conference in the future, where we can maybe go in more depth into some of the things that people have brought up and clearly will be able to give us a lot more information on. So thank you to everybody, and I'll say goodbye now.